Corrie ten Boom once said, "Never be afraid to trust an unknown future to a known God." We've been studying the life of David as we work our way through the book of 1 Samuel. And perhaps as much or more than any other character in all of the Bible except for Jesus, David experienced some of the highest highs and the lowest lows. He went from living in the king's court, married to the king's daughter, in command of the king's armies, and loved by all the people, to running for his life away from the king's court, his wife taken away from him, living in caves in the wilderness, hunted by the king like an animal, while being betrayed by the people who once loved him. David was equally acquainted with the joy and pleasure and plenty, and the bitterness of sorrow and want. There's a tendency for us, and it's the same with David, as we'll see, to give credit to God and to believe that he's with us when things are going our way, when times are good. And yet when things are not going our way, when times are hard, it is really easy to believe that it's because we've done something wrong, and so somehow God is not with us. Well, look, first of all, God is always with you. If you're a believer and follower of Christ, if you're in him and he is in you, God is always with you, regardless of your circumstances or how they come about, no matter how good or how bad things may seem to be. God is with you. We don't have time in this message to read the volumes of passages of Scripture that prove that God is always with you, but he is, and his word couldn't be any clearer on the matter. Secondly, when you tie God's favor and presence in your life to your circumstances, you're putting God in a box that cannot contain him, because his ability to work in your life on your behalf is in no way, shape, or form dependent upon or limited by your circumstances, because God is bigger than your circumstances. He's beyond what you can see, and he's working in places you haven't been, namely your future. You understand, God is not limited by space and time the way that we are. God is outside of space and time, and he's sovereign over all of it. And so before he created the heavens and the earth, he knew that he was going to create you. And he also knew every decision you would ever make, good, bad, or indifferent, including the decisions you would make to put your trust and faith in him and to follow him. Listen, before he ever created the heavens and the earth. And so when he created his plan for this world and everyone in it, before any of it ever existed, he factored into that plan every single decision you would ever make, which is why the Apostle Paul was able to say, and we know that for those who love God, which things? All things work together for good for those who are called according to his purpose, Romans 8:28. In other words, every single moment of your life, the good days and the hard days, were accounted for in his plan for your life before your life ever existed. Mary Beth just read it. In your book were written every one of my days when as yet there was none of them. Which means whatever you see for yourself from wherever you're standing right now, no matter how good things are looking, no matter how hard things may be looking, whatever it is you see for yourself from wherever you're standing right now, you have to understand there is more to your story. Whatever you think your life is going to look like in the days ahead, there's more to your story than what you can see or predict or even imagine, for that matter, because God is always working in your life on your behalf and beyond your present circumstances. When Jesus was being persecuted and questioned by the religious Jews about healing people on the Sabbath, Jesus said, "My Father is working until now, and I am working." John 5:17. In other words, even on the days when you think there's absolutely nothing happening, even then, God is working on your behalf. And of course, it's hard when you can't see it. It's hard to take comfort in that knowledge sometimes when you don't know what or why or how he's working. That's why we have stories like the one we're looking at today, because God's word and the stories within its pages are not only meant to be informative, they're meant to be transformative, right? This isn't just a story about how God worked in David's life. It's a story about how God works in the lives of his people, both then and now, even when we can't see it or predict it or even imagine it. So let's jump back into the story where we left off last time and get a glimpse into the work of God on behalf of his people, even when it doesn't seem like he's working at all. 1 Samuel chapter 27, where we left off last time, we'll begin with the first 4 verses. 1 Samuel 27, 1 through 4. Then David said in his heart, "Now I shall perish one day by the hand of Saul. There's nothing better for me than that I should escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will despair of seeking me any longer within the borders of Israel, and I shall escape out of his hand." So David arose and went over, he and the 600 men who were with him, to Achish, the son of Maoch, king of Gath. And David lived with Achish at Gath, he and his men, every man with his household, and David with his 2 wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail of Carmel, Nabal's widow. When it was told Saul that David had fled to Gath, he no longer sought him. Okay, so David has finally had enough of being hunted like an animal for doing nothing wrong. Remember, David and his men had all their families with them, which was most certainly taking a toll, right? I mean, it's one thing to go through something really difficult, but to watch your family suffer is a whole different level of hardship. And so David says, that's it, enough is enough. It's interesting to me what's going through his mind here. Now I shall perish one day by the hand of Saul. There's nothing better for me than that I should escape to the land of the Philistines. In other words, David's saying to himself, because of my circumstances, the very best thing that I can hope for is to live with my sworn enemies. And so David, along with his troops and their families, go to Gath, some 25 miles northwest of the desert of Ziph. And of course, Achish, the Philistine king, welcomes David with open arms because David is an infamous outlaw in Israel, and Achish knows it. In fact, he'd been coordinating his attacks on the Israelites at the times when Saul would go out into the wilderness with thousands of his very best soldiers to hunt David, as we saw back in chapter 23. And so for Achish, it's the old saying, my enemy's enemy is my friend. And for David, as far as he's concerned, living with the Philistines is the best he can hope for in order to survive and keep his family out of harm's way. And of course, David was chosen by God and anointed by Samuel as king of Israel. His future couldn't have been any brighter. The promises of God for David's life couldn't have been any better. And yet his present circumstances couldn't be much worse. And David was losing hope. Now I shall perish one day by the hand of Saul. Those are the words of a man who is losing faith in the promises of God for his own life. After all this time, after doing nothing against Saul, in fact, after honoring Saul and taking care of David's own 600 men and their families in the wilderness, after blessing all the people around him, even strangers all along the way, and staying faithful and true to God through it all, his circumstances have gone from bad to worse. And so as far as David was concerned, the best he could hope for was to go to a foreign land, into a foreign culture with their foreign religion and pagan gods, and eke out an existence surrounded by his mortal enemies in the hope that Saul would finally leave him alone. And it works. Saul breaks off his pursuit of David. This was everything David had hoped it would be. It's a respite from the constant turmoil David had been facing for so long at the hands of King Saul. And yet there was so much more going on than just David surviving his difficult circumstances. So much more that God was doing in and through David's circumstances on David's behalf that David couldn't see, which is the whole point. And it's the lesson that David had to learn. By the way, it's a lesson that we need to learn in our own difficult circumstances when tomorrow is uncertain and the future is unknown. Because listen, what God is doing in your life isn't always what it seems. There was far more happening in this story that meets the eye. David couldn't see, predict, or even imagine what God was doing on his behalf at this point in his life. He's just trying to keep himself and his family and those with him alive. And yet all the while, God was working, doing far more than just keeping David alive, as we're going to see. He was using David's circumstances to provide tremendous blessings and resources and prosperity for David and his family, and also for his men and their families, and for God's people for generations to come, while at the same time accomplishing his purposes for his people through David, and more specifically, through David's highly undesirable circumstances, living with the Philistines, which will all become clear as we continue in the story. The point is, what God is doing in your life is not always what it seems. And it certainly cannot be judged. It certainly cannot be judged by your circumstances alone. So don't judge God's faithfulness based on the favorability of your circumstances, because even though your circumstances constantly change, God's faithfulness never changes. The fact is, as bad as David's circumstances appeared to be, David was right where God wanted him, and he was about to accomplish through David and those circumstances what Saul and so many others before him refused to do. And in the process, David would be rewarded far beyond what he could see or predict or even imagine. Okay, when your circumstances are not what you want them to be, don't lose hope. Don't despair. Because even though you cannot always feel God with you or see him working for you, that doesn't mean he isn't with you and isn't working on your behalf. Because God, in fact, is always with you, and he is always working on your behalf. Okay, the same God who is at work in David's life in this story is working in your life today, whether you see it or not. Through all of the twists and turns, the hardships and heartaches, the long days of waiting and wondering why you're going through what you're going through. Listen, even through your own brokenness, what may seem to be the most irreconcilable circumstances, God is always, always, always working on your behalf, using every situation and every hurt and even those times of desperation to your ultimate good. Again, Paul said, for those who love God, all things work together for good for those who are called according to his purpose. Notice he didn't say, for those who love God, all pleasant things work together for good. He doesn't say, for those who love God, all healthy things work together for good. He didn't say, for those who love God, all successful things work together for good. No, he said, for those who love God, what things? All things work together for good. In other words, for those who love God, meaning his people, he's working every aspect of your life, the good, the bad, and the ugly. He's working all of it together ultimately for your good. Which, interestingly enough, is exactly what we find in this story about David. Everything that David saw as a deficit in his life, God saw as an asset. Because those heartaches and hardships and seemingly irreconcilable circumstances in David's life were the very means through which God brought blessing and provision and restoration in David's life. To the point that the joy and the blessing and the relationships that David enjoyed in the latter part of his life were infinitely greater than anything he could have ever seen or predicted or imagined in the earlier part of his life. But to get there, to get to the place where David was able to realize the fullness of all that God had for him, to get there, he had to travel through all of the things that God had planned for him. Not just all the pleasant things or the healthy things or the successful things. You see, there are no shortcuts to becoming what God created you to be. There is no easy button. You have to travel through all of the things that in the end get you where you're supposed to be. You can't skip a step or 2 or 10. Believe me, I wish we could sometimes. You can't skip a step or 2 and expect to end up in the same place that you would when you go through all of the things that he intends for you to go through. Right? To bake a delicious cake, a wonderfully sweet and beautifully decorated cake, you have to include all of the ingredients required to end up with that kind of cake, right? Yet some of the individual parts by themselves are not so sweet or beautiful at all. No one would enjoy eating a bowl of raw flour by itself. But you have to have flour to create the masterpiece of a cake. Raw eggs are not particularly pleasant to look at, for that matter, or to consume. But you need them for that cake to turn out the way it's supposed to be. There are individual ingredients in making a wonderful cake that are by themselves bitter, even harsh. But when combined with all of the other things in that recipe, the end result is far better than what you started with, and yet you can't leave out the unpleasant parts and expect to end up with the same result. God is constantly working which things? All things together for good in your life, because he knows all of the things that must be combined in your life to create the masterpiece that your life is intended to be. There's always more to your story. So just keep that in mind the next time you're facing difficult circumstances. So often what we view as deficits in our lives, God actually sees as assets as he combines all of it together to make something beautiful, even if you can't see it or predict it or imagine it from where you're standing right now, because what God is doing in your life isn't always what it seems. Chuck Swindoll said, "We are all faced with a series of great opportunities brilliantly disguised as impossible situations." Let's keep reading verses 5 through 7. Then David said to Achish, "If I have found favor in your eyes, let a place be given me in one of the country towns, that I may dwell there. For why should your servant dwell in the royal city with you?" So that day Achish gave him Ziklag. Therefore Ziklag has belonged to the kings of Judah to this day. And the number of the days that David lived in the country of the Philistines was 1 year and 4 months. So David asked the Philistine king for some land where he and his people could dwell. More specifically, he asked for land outside of the royal city. And of course, David frames his request from a position of humility, not being deserving to live in such a prestigious place among the Philistines, when in reality, David probably wanted to put distance between him and Achish, the king, in order to try and rebuild his relationship with the Israelites without Achish knowing, and we'll see that later. And asking a vassal king for land was actually a common feudal practice in antiquity. So being convinced of David's irreconcilable differences with Israel and its king, Achish is all too happy to give David some land far from the city, where the Philistine people would be less apt to resent the king for keeping David around, given David's overwhelming military victories over them in the past. And so Achish gives David Ziklag. It's about 25 miles southwest of Gath, close to the southernmost border of Israel. In fact, Ziklag was technically territory that had been assigned to both the tribes of Simeon in Joshua 19:5 and Judah in Joshua 15:31, but the Israelites had never conquered it as they were commanded to do on the conquest of Canaan, and we're going to come back to that. So David, in his retreat from Saul, settles in Ziklag, one of the results being that Ziklag has belonged to the kings of Judah to this day. In other words, because David's crummy circumstances, land that God had given to the Israelites that they never possessed was now permanently in their possession. You see, what God is doing in your life is never just about you. Your story is never just about you, because you're one part of an entire body, which means whether you like it or not, you are connected, inseparably bound to the other members of the body. And so everything that you do affects someone else. And everything that God is doing in your life affects someone else, which means there's always more to your story than simply how your circumstances are affecting you personally. And it's not that God doesn't care about how your circumstances affect you personally, because he does care deeply and profoundly. He cares about every single detail of your life, in fact. But he also cares about all the other parts of the body, all of the other people who are affected by every detail of your life as well. There's no way David could have known the day he moved to Ziklag the long-lasting effect that his presence there would have on generations of Israelites after him. But remember, God is always working beyond what you can see or predict or even imagine, and not just for you, but for those you're connected to, right? There are a few things as profoundly influential in our lives as family, right? Whether that influence is positive or negative, by the way. The effects of family in our upbringing reverberates throughout the rest of our lives. So, for instance, the degree to which a person is or is not nurtured and cared for and encouraged within that family, the existence of or absence of accountability between family members, the use of or lack of discipline, and the amount of or lack of affirmation that one receives as a member of that family, just to name a few. Those dynamics, those family dynamics have tremendous influence in our lives, one way or the other. In fact, there's a Barna study. Nearly 2/3 of Americans polled said that family was the number one factor in their lives in determining their identity. Being an American was second, and their religious faith was ranked third. So the majority of people carry the effects of their family influences with them throughout their lives to one degree or another, to the point that our lives are often shaped by those relationships. And then along comes Jesus, who not only came to show us the way to the next life, but he also came to show us how to live in this one. And so he invited us to become members of his spiritual family, which turns out is vitally important and formative in shaping who we become, our identity, because we are, as members of his body, eternally connected to one another. It's why the Apostle Paul said, if one member suffers, all suffer together. If one member is honored, all rejoice together. 1 Corinthians 12:26. Because what God is doing in your life through your circumstances, whether they're good or bad, it affects other people. Here's the point. You have a responsibility to always consider how your choices, your decisions, especially when facing difficult circumstances that you have to respond to. You have a responsibility to always consider the effect those decisions will have on the people you're connected to. Why? Because the story is never just about you. It's about you and every other person that God has put in your life. And you can't ignore that, not at least if you want to truly understand what God is up to in your life. Right? Because your story is always a part of something or someone else's story. And so the next time you find yourself in a difficult spot, before you look for the closest exit from those circumstances, first take a moment and ask, God, why have you brought me here? Because it may just be you're there to fight through something for someone else, to take ground for someone else to occupy, to be a blessing to someone who cannot do what you can do, who cannot provide what you can provide. Okay? There's always more to your story than just how it's affecting you. And so if you don't want to miss all that God is doing in your life, then pay attention to what he's doing in other people's lives through yours. Because he is doing something. G.K. Chesterton once said, the true soldier fights not because he hates what is in front of him, but because he loves what is behind him. Let's finish the story for today, verse 8 to the end of the chapter. Now David and his men went up and made raids against the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites, for these were the inhabitants of the land from of old, as far as Shur to the land of Egypt. And David would strike the land and would leave neither man nor woman alive, but would take away the sheep, the oxen, the donkeys, the camels, and the garments, and come back to Achish. When Achish asked, where have you made a raid today? David would say, against the Negeb of Judah, or against the Negeb of the Jerahmeelites, or against the Negeb of the Kenites. And David would leave neither man nor woman alive to bring news to Gath, thinking, lest they should tell about us and say, so David has done. Such was his custom all the while he lived in the country of the Philistines. And Achish trusted David, thinking, he has made himself an utter stench to the people to his people Israel. Therefore, he shall always be my servant. So after moving into Ziklag with his family and his 600 men and their families, David knows that they're safely out of reach of Saul, but he also knows that he has to provide for all these people in this new rugged and largely undeveloped territory. And so he promptly begins raiding Canaanite cities and towns nearby, killing everyone in the process, keeping the spoils of war as provisions for his people, and yet always careful to share his bounty with Achish, the Philistine king, who asked David what cities he's been raiding. And so David not only gives Achish the names of Israelite-controlled territories, which was plausible enough because, again, Ziklag was close to Israel's southern border, But he also kills every human soul in the process in the towns and cities he was actually raiding, which for David's part served a very practical purpose, to keep anyone from being able to report to Achish that David was attacking Canaanite territories, not Israelite territories. But there's far more to the story. There's far more here than meets the eye, because even in what seems to be a cruel and ungodly war for David to obtain the, ungodly way rather, for David to obtain the provisions that he and his men and their families need, God has a greater purpose in it as he uses David in these violent circumstances to accomplish his purposes for the promised land from the time of Moses. Because from the beginning of their exodus from Egypt through their journey to the promised land, there was a Torah mandate, a very specific military assignment under the law to conquer the promised land, applying the Kerem principle in the process. We talked about this all the way back in chapter 14. The Hebrew term Kerem, or what was referred to as the Kerem principle, was very familiar to the Hebrew people. It's a word we don't really have a good equivalent for in our modern English language, as it is an ancient term that referred to the special action of setting something apart permanently as property of God, that belonged to God. So it was to put something under Kerem was to radically devote that person or that place or that thing to the Lord. Listen, either for service or for destruction. So the Kerem principle was an all or nothing proposition. And so when entire cities or entire populations were placed under Kerem, that usually involved the complete annihilation of that city and its people, which, by the way, wasn't unique to the Israelites. In the Mesha stele, the Moabite stone located in modern-day Jordan, there are 9th century inscriptions that describe King Mesha of Moab capturing Israelite cities and putting them under Kerem, total destruction in order to honor the Moabite god Chemosh. The point being, the principle of Kerem was widely understood in the ancient Near East by many people, so that this order by God to Moses, then to Joshua, then through Samuel, and on to Saul, and on to the Israelites, it was widely understood. And of course, this offends our modern sensibilities and sensitivities, but you have to understand that this Kerem principle was employed by God, first of all, to prevent his chosen people from experiencing precisely what they ended up experiencing throughout their history, because they failed to follow through with Kerem over their enemies time and time again. The people in and around Canaan, okay, were deeply, profoundly wicked people. You can read the gory details in Leviticus 18:6 through 30 and Deuteronomy 18:9 through 14 if you like. In fact, we even have ancient apocryphal writings. The 2nd century BC Wisdom of Solomon is one example, which together with biblical scripture details Canaanite practices of witchcraft, incest, bestiality, child sacrifice by burning the child alive and then cannibalizing their bodies and drinking the blood of those innocent children, not to mention just about every other kind of sexual deviation you do not want to imagine. And that's just to name a few of the Canaanites' favorite pastimes. When you add the depravity of these pagan cultures with the fact that the Amalekites, one of David's targets here, were unrelentingly brutal toward the Israelites for centuries, a race of people, by the way, whose DNA was arguably linked to the Nephilim, giant races described throughout Israel's history. Is it any wonder God didn't want his chosen people mixing their Hebrew culture with the pagan cultures and demonically controlled peoples around them? So God commands his people to apply the Kerem principle, to destroy the inhabitants of Canaan. From Moses on to Saul, he tells them to apply Kerem, and yet one after the other, they failed to do so. Here's where it gets really interesting. Because all three of these groups, the Geshurites, Girzites, and Amalekites, were under the ban. They were under the Kerem command of the Torah in Deuteronomy 20:16 and 17, meaning none of them were to be spared by the Israelites in warfare. And so here is David, who's simply trying to provide for himself and his people without being caught by the Philistine king. He's actually fulfilling the ancient law that none of the Israelite rulers before him were willing to do by continuing the conquest of Canaan. which is why he does not incur, by the way, blood guilt on himself or his men in the process, because even though David is serving his own purpose through these unpleasant circumstances, God is using those very same unpleasant circumstances in David's life to accomplish his own purposes, clearly laid out before his people from long ago. So look, as much as God will use your difficult circumstances in life to provide for you in ways you cannot see or predict or even imagine, there's always more to the story, because what God is doing in your life always serves his purposes. Okay, no matter what is happening in your life, you can rest assured that God has a purpose for it. Because this journey that you're on as a Christian is ultimately about Jesus Christ and his purpose for your life, which means at times in your life, if you're truly following Christ, he will lead you places you do not want to go. But that's okay, because you can't always see or predict or even imagine where that journey is meant to lead you. I mean, I don't think the Apostle Paul wanted to be beaten any more than Jesus wanted to be crucified, or John the Baptist wanted to be beheaded, any more than we want to be led into difficult circumstances today. But sometimes the Spirit of Christ leads us into places we do not want to go for our good and for his glory. And it is in those difficult circumstances that you have to decide whether or not you're going to submit to the leading of the Spirit in your life or abandon the journey he has you on, as difficult as it may be at times. Because he's going to lead you. Listen, God is going to lead you to love people who will never love you back. I guarantee it. Sometimes he's going to lead you to give more than you want to give. Sometimes he's going to lead you to serve where you do not feel like serving. Sometimes he's going to lead you to risk what you never thought you'd have to. Sometimes he's going to lead you to let go of something you do not want to give up. Sometimes he's going to lead you to lay everything on the line for him. And in those most challenging circumstances, you're going to be confronted with the reality that this journey you're on is ultimately about his purposes being accomplished in your life for your good and for his glory. David's conquest of those Canaanite territories provided tremendous blessings for him and his family and his people, but it also brought great glory to God as his ancient commands were finally being fulfilled, whether David realized it or not. So look, the next time you're facing something truly difficult, something that's testing your limits, just remember, there's always a purpose, a God-given purpose beyond what you can see or predict or even imagine. And that purpose is always, 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 always for your good. Don't miss it, because it's hard sometimes. A.W. Tozer said, God is looking for those with whom he can do the impossible. What a pity that we plan only the things that we can do by ourselves. Okay, when things are not going our way, when times are hard, I know it's really easy to lose perspective. I can tell you all about that. To believe that the hard things are happening to us because we've done something wrong, or that somehow God is not with us. Yet when you begin to understand and accept that God has a purpose in everything you ever have to walk through in this life, look, whether you helped create those circumstances or not, well, then you'll begin to see your circumstances in a whole new light. Because first of all, God is absolutely with you every single step of the way. And secondly, he has a purpose in everything, a great purpose for your good and for his glory. So don't put God in a box. Don't limit in your own heart and mind what he's able to do in you and through you based on your circumstances. Because listen, God's ability to work in your life on your behalf is in no way, shape, or form dependent upon or limited by your circumstances, no matter how hard they may be. Because he's bigger than your circumstances. He's beyond what you can see, and he's working in places you haven't been. Namely, your future. And so even when you can't see it or predict it or even imagine it, you can believe it, that there's more to your story because he loves you